Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to IGE Forum. As you know, the world now stands at a pivotal moment in the history of, in the modern history, as we confront devastating headwinds from geopolitical tensions and economic challenges. The geopolitical dynamics have been under severe stress by the rising US-China tension, the prolonged Russia-Ukraine war, along with the increasing Russian nuclear threats, and the intensifying North Korean provocations, further complicating security concerns, especially in the Northeast Asia. In this context, it is indeed high time for South Korea to set the right strategic priorities. At this backdrop, today we are most fortunate to have an outstanding guest speaker, Dr. Victor Cha, a leading authority on US foreign policy, especially regarding Asia. He will be joining us live from Washington, DC, to review key diplomatic and security policies of President Yoon's administration over the past year, and discuss strategic implications for strengthening Korea's alliance with the United States and Japan. Dr. Cha is currently a professor and vice dean at Georgetown, and also a senior vice president for Asia and Korea chair at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Cha is former director for Asian Affairs for the White House National Security Council and has served as President George W. Bush's top advisor on North Korean affairs. He holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University, and this year just named the Distinguished University Professor, the highest honor bestowed upon a tenured faculty at Georgetown University, and the youngest distinguished became. Congratulations. Without further ado, let's welcome and congratulate Dr. Victor Cha, who will speak first for about 30 minutes or so, followed by the discussion and the Q&A as scheduled. Victor, congratulations one more time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. Thank you so much for inviting me back to the IGE seminar. I really enjoyed my time with you last year, and I'm very happy to be a part of the discussion again this year. So to all the participants, good morning to you in Korea. It's evening here in Washington, DC. And I guess I would start out by saying that I find the IGE seminars extremely intellectually stimulating. I enjoy the discussion, I enjoy the conversation, and I look forward to our discussion this morning or this evening here in Washington. Let me begin by saying I agree entirely with your initial remarks in the sense that we're meeting at a time when quite literally the world is on fire. The war in Europe shows us that the notion of many of our theories about peace, whether they had to do with economic interdependence, European integration, all of these theories have been proved wrong by the horrible war that is now over a year old in the middle of Europe. And that just does not have implications for Europe. It has implications for the United States. It has implications for Asia. It has implications for Korea. In addition to the war, China and China's actions, their activities, their intentions are creating also a great deal of uncertainty in the external environment for every country in Asia as well as the United States. And then you add to that, of course, as you just noted, North Korea's unending pace of ballistic missile testing and nuclear weapons development that currently looks like it is unstoppable. It too is now over a year old, and they are already on pace in the first quarter of 2023 to match or exceed what they did in all of 2022, which was by far the most unprecedented year of missile testing that we've seen in the history of their nuclear program. When you add to all of these things, the dynamic that these three countries are growing closer and closer together, particularly North Korea and Russia and North Korea and China, and of course, Xi Jinping and Putin's recent summit meeting, this creates an extremely uncertain and insecure external environment for all countries, including big powers like the United States, as well as countries like Korea. So this is an unprecedented external environment, in many ways more intense and more unpredictable than during the Cold War. It's in this context that we are now approaching the one-year anniversary of President Yoon's administration. In only a matter of weeks, he will be, in less than a month, he will be in Washington for the state visit hosted by President and Dr. Jill Biden. This is an incredible honor that is bestowed upon the White House to President Yoon. The White House traditionally doesn't give more than 2 or 3 state visits a year to visiting heads of state. And the last one that was given was to President Macron of France. And this is the next one after that. And of course, clearly it's to celebrate 70 years of the alliance, but I think it's also to welcome and recognize many of the foreign policy efforts by President Yoon that he has made in his first year in office. And I wanted to sort of review these as a platform for discussion. And now, as you all know, President Yoon was not a foreign policy specialist when he became president. He has never been elected to office, certainly never had to deal with foreign policy, and never was trained, whether in school or otherwise, in foreign policy. But I think he's a very good student of foreign policy, and he had good teachers around him. Perhaps even some of the people on this call know him and have spoken to him about foreign policy. My first encounter with his foreign policy training was completely by accident. I was staying at the Four Seasons Hotel in Gwanghwamun, and I noticed that there was a seminar taking place, a private foreign policy seminar. I was there at the Four Seasons, and I had an appointment to meet with Kim Sung-han, who was then to be the national security advisor. And the foreign policy seminar was for then President Yoon, with a group of international relations scholars and former officials to help him to understand foreign policy. So I thought that was good, that he was being a student of foreign policy and not just listening to political people, but listening to experts around him, substantive experts about different foreign policy issues. But I have to say the thing that gave me the most confidence about his foreign policy without yet having spoken to him was watching one of his campaign debates with the then ruling party candidate. It was a televised debate, and the topic was foreign policy. And and what was interesting to me was that President Yoon, who had not had any experience on foreign policy, focused on 2 things: freedom and democracy. That whatever his foreign policy towards country X or country Y would be, it would be guided by a focus on freedom and democracy. In other words, it was a values-based foreign policy, which I thought was very important. Foreign policy, I believe, should not simply be transactional and should not simply follow immediate self-interest. If foreign policy is simply self-interest and simply transactional, it can take you in unpredictable directions. But if your foreign policy, of course, is based in self-interest, but it's also grounded in core values, like the promotion of freedom and democracy, the defense of freedom and democracy around the world, even though you may be making decisions based on self-interest, those values ensure that you always go in the right direction. They ensure that you don't go in a wrong direction. And while I did not know anything about his foreign policy at the time, to me, that was a very good sign. That was a very good signal of his of the importance of how he was thinking about foreign policy. I had the chance to meet him and spend, quite a bit of time with him in a very small group last year, a few months after he took office. And what he had said during the campaign clearly came across in meeting him privately, that he thought he was very focused on a values-based foreign policy, which helped him to understand what were the priorities that he should pursue in terms of relationship with others, other countries, or on other issues. And again, so that reinforced my understanding that he was pursuing a type of foreign policy that would be very welcome in Washington, D.C. The objectives of foreign policy, I think, are very clear for the Yoon administration. It's very clear that a core element of foreign policy is the relationship with the United States. This has been stated very clearly. It was stated very clearly when his special envoy delegation came to Washington. We hosted them at CSIS, led by then soon to become a foreign minister Park Jin, as well as Ambassador Cho Tae-young, where they said, at the very first sentence they said was that the alliance is core. The alliance is key to our foreign policy vision. Second, of course, is the improvement of relations with Japan, to turn around the relationship with Japan. Third, on North Korea, was to be tough on North Korea, to continue to push for denuclearization with North Korea, but at the same time to be open to dialogue. And then with regard to a regional and global role, Park Jin unveiled the term GPS at the time, global pivotal state, signaling that the Yoon administration would no longer sit on the sidelines when it came to regional diplomacy and global diplomacy, that they were going to lean forward and be a very active participant. And then fifth, in terms of China, the focus was on mutual respect in the relationship with China and the important economic relationship with China. In a nutshell, these were sort of the 5 objectives that they signaled that they were going to pursue. And I think they've done so pretty well. If we start first with the United States and the alliance, clearly a very excellent first summit meeting that President Yoon hosted for President Biden, literally only days after he took office, President Yoon took office. What struck me about this first meeting was the personal chemistry between the two leaders. When I was at the White House and we were arranging summit meetings, especially with a new leader, whether it was in Japan or Korea or Australia or wherever it was in the world, the first meeting was so important because the personal chemistry between the two leaders was something that would really determine the overall tenor of the relationship. And so, for example, the first meeting between President Bush and President Lee Myung-bak was a very good first meeting. Personal chemistry was very good. The first meeting between President Bush and President Kim Dae-jung, the chemistry was not there. It wasn't a good meeting, and that really does affect the overall relationship. But I thought this first meeting that took place in Korea was very good. The chemistry was there. The two leaders, I think, really got to know each other and like each other. But it just wasn't about personal chemistry. On North Korea, there was a symmetry there in views between President Yoon and President Biden that, frankly, were not there in the previous administration. I think in the previous administration, the public face was always very positive that there is alignment on views towards North Korea, but privately, of course, there wasn't. The United States was focused on sanctions and denuclearization, and the previous government wasn't focused on sanctions and denuclearization. They were focused on peace regime and inter-Korean reconciliation. And so that inevitably led to tensions in the relationship. And I don't think those tensions are there today. I think there's a much more of a closer alignment on views. Of course, both Seoul and Washington are open to negotiations with North Korea. They're willing to talk with North Korea. But in the meantime, while North Korea is doing all this testing, there's a very strong alignment of views. In terms of the defense relationship, I think there were three things that are very important to note. First is, right off the bat, the first thing that the Biden administration, the Yoon government did was resolve the special measures agreement controversy. This was a legacy of the Trump administration, where Trump was demanding 5 times the regular, the sort of standard South Korean contribution per year to cost sharing, defense burden sharing, which created a real difficult period in the U.S.-Korea relationship. Really, I think, angered the South Korean people that the United States could be so greedy and ask for so much. So the first thing that they did was resolve that issue in a very good agreement. The second was to restore military exercising, which had fallen off between the United States and Korea during the Trump summits with North Korea. This exercising, again, the USFK commander publicly was saying that they could substitute for live fire and field maneuver exercises through computer simulations and maintain readiness. But the reality, of course, was that that without exercising, militaries can have real problems, and that deterrence and readiness on the peninsula was deteriorating during this period of no exercising. All you have to do is look at the difficulty the Russians are having in Ukraine, and there is an example of a military that has not been exercising, and they don't perform well. So that was restored. And then third was really the focus, perhaps not to the satisfaction of all South Koreans, but really the focus on enhancing extended deterrence. The United States heard very clearly from the Yoon government about concerns about extended deterrence given North Korea's nuclear and weapons demonstrations. And so they undertook a very high tempo of meetings to try to do things to enhance extended deterrence. There's a list of these things. It's almost a dozen items that have been done. Again, they may not be enough to satisfy most Koreans, but there's clearly been an effort to try to do that to improve the relationship. Some of the things, I'm happy to say that some of the things that that CSIS recommended in a report that we did on North Korea policy and on extended deterrence look to have been adopted by the administration. These included trilateral missile defense exercises, where we just saw a major one among the 3 allies in Hawaii over the summer in August. More integrated sharing of early warning capabilities, early warning information. This again is important to extended deterrence. It's important to trilateral cooperation. It was also something that we recommended in our report. And the third thing that we recommended, which I don't think the administration has adopted yet, but I think that they're thinking about, is to create a nuclear planning group. In other words, to give South Korean and Japanese allies a better understanding of how the United States thinks about nuclear contingencies involving nuclear weapons. This isn't the same thing as nuclear sharing, but this is nuclear planning to bring them more into planning along the lines of what the United States does with NATO allies. Another big and very important area of cooperation in the alliance has been in the arena of economic security. This, as I think our distinguished discussants know well, has become a very important issue in around the world with China's weaponization of economic interdependence. Korea was one of the earliest victims of this in 2016, 2017, when China imposed sanctions because of the THAAD battery that was placed in Korea. But many other countries after that, almost 17 countries, have suffered from Chinese economic coercion. And I think the Yoon government clearly has made choices with regard to this. They have chosen to go along with the idea of reshoring and friendshoring, working more with like-minded partners in open societies when it comes to commanding heights, the protection and manufacturing of items using commanding heights technology, whether this is in EV batteries or in memory chips, big investments, as you all know well, in the United States signal very clearly that Korea wants to be part of this economic security and supply chain coalition with countries that are much more predictable and more open. Korea also joined something called the Minerals Security Partnership, or MSP, which is a group led by the United States of countries that want to ensure the secure supply of critical minerals that are necessary for producing all sorts of things. So Korea has been a very important player in that. And then the third element, I think, in terms of the alliance is the new frontier. Something that's been featured, I think, by Yoon and Biden is the new frontiers of the alliance. And that refers to all the areas with which the United States and South Korea are willing to work together on that go outside of the traditional military issues to include things like cooperation in terms of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, global health, economic development assistance, culture, pop culture. The list goes on and on and on. But these are really the new frontiers of the alliance. These are the new issue areas for the alliance that really encompass a new generation of Americans and Koreans who are working in tech and in AI and in computer science and in engineering and bioscience. All of these areas are new constituencies, a new generation of people that are becoming part of this partnership between the United States and Korea. And the purpose of this partnership is not just to provide private goods to the two alliance members, but also to provide public goods, whether we're talking about new antiviral drugs against the coronavirus, or we're talking about vaccines against coronavirus, or we're talking about working together in outer space to de-weaponize outer space and ensure that it's a safe place for satellites to operate. There are many areas in which the two countries are working together. We actually have a new project at CSIS called Alliance 3.0. The idea being that the Alliance 1.0 was the Korean War generation. Alliance 2.0 was the Chorus FTA generation. And Alliance 3.0 are these younger people who are working in these new frontier areas of the alliance. And so what we are doing is we brought together about a dozen of these Korean graduate students studying at US universities who are working in these areas, computer science, engineering, bioscience, pop culture, all these areas, to educate them about the history of the alliance and why what they are doing constitute a very important part of the new frontiers of the U.S.-Korea alliance. Let me move briefly to talk a little bit about Japan, since I think that's another important part of the UN foreign policy. I know that policy towards Japan is always controversial in Korea, and there's often very little disagreement. In my opinion, and it's just one person's opinion, I don't represent the views of the US government or anybody else, but I really think that President Yoon has showed real leadership on Japan. He made the decision very early on to focus on repairing and improving relations with Japan. When Park Jin came as a special envoy, he made this very clear that this was one of Yoon's objectives. So they made the decision very early to do this, and we're very clear about it. And then second, after doing that, they sent very costly signals about their seriousness in pursuing this. And what I mean by costly signals is they sent messages to Japan publicly that they know would be criticized in Korea. President Yoon's March 1st speech, his Samil speech, his August 15th speech, really used a narrative very different about Japan than we've seen Korean leaders use in the past. And he took a lot of criticism for that. But at the same time, I think in Washington and in Tokyo, these signals really registered with regard to the seriousness with which President Yoon planned to pursue improving relations with Japan. Of course, we saw the result of this in terms of the forced labor compensation agreement. Again, I know that this was a very controversial agreement in Korea. There's been a lot of criticism of it being humiliating because the Koreans did everything and Japan did nothing. But again, I think it to me it shows one, real leadership on the part of Yoon. Leadership often means not going the way the wind blows, but charting out a path on your own. Two, I thought it showed a lot of confidence in the sense that Yoon focused more on the importance of reconciling with Japan for other foreign policy objectives he was pursuing, and saying that the Korean government would compensate laborers using Korean companies and Korean money and not be reliant on hoping for some sort of contribution from Japan. I thought it was courageous. I mean, it's criticized as courageous, but I thought it was also a sign of confidence. And the results of this, at least going forward, are very clearly, the first visit by a South Korean president to Japan for a summit in over a dozen years. The state visit in Washington on April 26th, where he will be very, very widely celebrated with his day at the White House, speech before Congress, the White House dinner. And then, of course, the G7 summit that will follow in May in Hiroshima. These, I think, are all going to be things in which Yoon's leadership and his accomplishments will be recognized by not just the United States, but other countries as well. And I would say again, I know this has been criticized a lot and it's controversial, and some folks on the call may not agree with me, but clearly I don't think President Yoon did this because he was only focused on reconciling relations with Japan. I think it was really both also an understanding that in order to pursue his GPS strategy as a global pivotal state, in order to be able to be more active in the Quad or in the free and open Indo-Pacific, or even in other relationships, other sorts of formations in the region and in the world, that Japan had to be supportive of that, and that wasn't going to happen until the two countries resolved their issues. So Japan, took the export control issue off the table. The two sides have normalized intelligence sharing through GSOMIA, and I think there'll be many other things going forward that these countries could cooperate on. So I think it's a very important, and difficult step that Yoon was willing to take. On North Korea, it's a very difficult and terrible situation. This situation, of course, pre-existed the Yoon government. I mean, this was a situation that they inherited. The difficulties that we've seen with North Korea are not, I don't think they're because of Yoon, but they've existed there and he's inherited it. My concern now is that North Korea really has moved beyond the testing phase, the developmental testing phase. In many of their recent missile launches, they are moving into an exercising phase. In other words, they're not testing simply to develop new weapons, although some clearly are for that purpose. They are moving now more into these tests, these launches being examples of exercises that they are carrying out. So a long-range ICBM test is to keep the US off the peninsula. Multiple short-range ballistic missile tests are to show that they can strike all targets in Japan. And then flying bombers and fighters up to the midline between the two Koreas and flying back is all part of, I see that as part of a sequenced exercise. So that's very concerning. They're not interested in dialogue with the United States or anyone at this point. The Biden administration has tried both publicly and privately many times to have a negotiation with North Korea, and there doesn't appear to be any interest. So the focus has been on defense and deterrence very clearly, and on improving exercising bilaterally with the ROK and trilaterally with Japan. When will there be an opening for negotiations? I think most believe it's not going to happen before they do their long-awaited 7th nuclear test. When they might come out for negotiations, what those negotiations would look like, I can't tell you for certain, but until then, I don't think there's much hope that there would be any sort of dialogue. In my personal opinion, I think the focus on defense exercising and deterrence and extended deterrence is important and required. But I also believe that there should be more focus and stress on human rights by the United States and by other countries, because it is an element of our policy, our values-based foreign policy. It is one that puts a lot of pressure on the North Korean regime, more so than sanctions, economic sanctions, one could argue, and yet we've allowed it to fall off the radar screen for no apparent reason. I've gone on for a long, but let me just quickly say something about China. I think, to me, the most interesting aspect right now to track with regard to President Yoon's foreign policy is China, because I think it's very different from the signals that they have sent with regard to the United States, with regard to Japan, with regard to North Korea, with regard to regional and global role, in the sense that the Yoon administration has sent very clear signals on those 4 or 5 other issues, whereas on China, they haven't sent those strong signals, but they've been very polite with regard to China. The talking points are about mutual respect, about China as an important economic partner, and about wanting to have good relations with China. So it's a very uncontroversial set of talking points that neither expresses a great deal of enthusiasm, but also not a great deal of animosity towards China. But at the same time, while those have been sort of the points that they've laid out, if you look at their actions clearly show an incremental shifting of policy of the previous administration that was leaning towards China to one that is clearly leaning away from China. And I think this started early on without the immediate sending of a special envoy to China, the focus on freedom and democracy, the tightening of the trilateral relationship with the United States and Japan, the interest in the Quad and working in the Quad and being a part of the Quad and Quad work streams, the acceptance of defensive Taiwan language in both of the Biden and Yun joint statements, as well as the trilateral joint statement among the US, Japan, and South Korea. The willingness to do trilateral missile defense exercises and more missile defense exercising with the United States and trilaterally with Japan, which is, a clear step away from the 3 no's that the previous government had agreed to with China after the THAAD controversy. And then the joining of all of these supply chain coalitions, the Mineral Security Partnership, the focus on economic security, the Chip 4, and potentially export controls. These are all a series of steps that South Korea has taken that are clearly moving away from China, but they're being done in a very subtle and quiet way, so that it's difficult for China to really target them. If China raises a concern about any of them, the Yun government goes back to their talking points about mutual respect, important economic partner, and wanting to have good relations with its neighbor. So I think it's very interesting to watch. It's embarrassing for the Chinese to criticize South Korea because it will reflect a failure of their own policy. And also because the South Koreans still say very clearly their policies about mutual respect, important economic partner, and wanting to have good relations. But the Chinese, I think, sense there is something definitely taking place here, and they're quite worried about it. I think they are quite concerned, quite worried about it. To finish, let me say the challenges going forward. I mean, very clearly, domestic politics. There's an election in Korea, a very important election that will determine the legislature, very important for President Yun in his remaining time in office. Of course, US elections and concerns about whether we'll have another America First president, I think certainly worries Koreans. I think going forward, another big concern is Chinese economic pressure and coercion. I think China feels that they've been very successful at this. They have, as I said, economically coerced over 17 countries and over 120 companies in the last 10 years. Koreans are clearly worried about that. The elections in Taiwan also are a big uncertainty in terms of whether there'll be an even more vocal pro-independence candidate that wins the election. And then, of course, continuing North Korean issues, as well as the evolving discussion and debate in South Korea about nuclear options, which I think people here in Washington are watching very closely. So there's a lot, I think, there on the agenda for the Yun government and for the alliance going forward. This is a great year. It's the 70th year of the alliance, and I think the alliance is in very good shape in its 70th year. But I think there's a lot of potential with regard to Korea's regional and global role, but still a lot of challenges, particularly with regard to North Korea and China. So with that, please let me turn the floor back to Dr. Jun, and thank you again for your attention.
Very much, Victor, for your great opening statement. You gave us a good sense about the key policy objectives of Yun administration, starting with five of those, and the kind of progress that we have seen over the past years, and finally, many issues and policy options to be explored down the road. I appreciate that sort of great overview, assessment, and suggestions very much. Now, I would like to open for discussion. We have three distinguished discussants for today's topic. Let me start with Dr. Yu Jang-hee. He's a professor emeritus at Ewha Women's University, and he's former chairman of the Korea Commission on Shared Growth, as well as president of the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, KIEP, among many other senior positions. I'd like to start with Professor Yu. Welcome, Dr. Yu.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Chun. Do you hear me all right?
Yes, just fine.
Okay.
Great. Yeah.
All right. Good evening, Victor. Good to see you on video. You look great. I was going to say that the last name Cha and the last name Yu, which is mine, are actually in the same family from long time ago. You know, we don't get married to each other. And these two families are holding like an annual conference, clan conference together in Korea. So I was going to let our friends know that Victor and I are in the same family. Victor, it's great. Your evaluation of Korea's relationship with the US and Japan, North Korea, China, even Taiwan, is really insightful and pinpointing, and very balanced, as I feel, and I really appreciate it. I was going to sort of shift our sort of gear a little bit toward the global contents. That is, you know, as you know, it was yesterday that Democracy Summit meeting was held on the leadership of Korea and the United States, and there are many democratic countries participated in the video conference, and they sort of emphasized that we have to solidify the alliance among the democratic countries and forge the economic and diplomatic relationship in response to the communistic pressures nowadays. On the basis of what they discussed yesterday, some scholars even sort of proposed that now it seems to be about the time to think about to form a second United Nations or the second WTO, only including the LMCs, like-minded countries. The reason is that the United Nations does not function effectively nowadays because of the permanent members of the Security Council, and even WTO does not function either due to the malfunction of the dispute settlement body in itself. So the world supposed to be able to find the new ways of solving all these sensitive issues. If it's not all the countries in the world, only the like-minded countries should get together and try to find the path to find the solution for these sensitive issues of the world. What do you think? Like a second United Nations or second WTO?
So I think, Dr. Yu, it's good to see you, and I agree that given the state of the great power relationship today, and among the Perm 5 members of the UN Security Council is in crisis right now. I think in many ways, the efforts that were made to reform the UN, or the efforts that were being made to reform the UN, was it over almost 20 years ago? I think probably many people regret that. I mean, part of that was UN Security Council reform, and probably many regret that today because those reforms never really happened with regard to the permanent members. And now in many ways, the UN is stymied. And we see it most obviously with North Korean activity, North Korean testing, where according to previous resolutions, the Perm 5 members and the Security Council are supposed to follow through on certain actions, and they simply cannot because of Russian and Chinese opposition. Even on the issue of human rights, there was an effort by all the other members of the UN Security Council last month to have a conversation about North Korean human rights, and it was opposed by Russia and China. So the UN member states actually met informally outside of the Security Council format to have that conversation. So my point is that people, I think, are looking for ad hoc workarounds, and the idea of LMCs, like-minded countries, coming together is a very interesting one, and I think a lot more attention should be paid to it. Again, bringing it back to the Korean Peninsula, what we see is we see statements being made by G7 foreign ministers with regard to responding to North Korean nuclear tests. Or in the EU, we see an anti-economic coercion, coercion instruments being discussed among EU members with regard to Chinese economic coercion. So this notion of LMCs, alternative groupings that are rulemaking and liberal international order supporting groupings, I think is a very important one.
Thank you.
Satisfied, Dr. Yu?
Oh, thank you. Great.
Interesting and provocative question. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to move on to connect to Dr. An Chung-Young, distinguished professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Chungang University and former chairman of the Korea Commission for Corporate Partnership, among other important posts, for his comments or questions. Dr. An? You are on. Professor An, please.
Yes. Good evening, Victor. First of all, congratulations on your being appointed as university professor. And I always appreciate the great policy recommendation from the CSIS under your leadership. Well, it's always a pleasure to recall, you see, we got together at the Opinion Leader Seminar, which I worked as a president of the KIEP in early 2000s with the help of the KEI. Well, we talked about all the time, Geneva process and the CVID of North Korean nuclear ambitions, but to me, nothing has changed. Well, what that brief, comment, I think I really agree with many points you brought up. But let me take this opportunity to focus a little bit on the economic, collaboration between the U.S. and Korea. As you said, this, Yoon government really clearly shifted from the strategic ambiguity, which was prevailed during Moon Jae-in administration, to strategic clarity to align fully with the U.S. value system, democracy and the human right, and now U.S. and Korea move on to establish a very comprehensive strategic, even economic partnership. And today you also mentioned that the President Yoon and President Biden had a very, very good chemistry. And I hope, this Korea's policy shift and great chemistry between two leaders will produce a truly tangible economic, the result for the benefit of two countries. Well, responding to President Biden's request for the U.S. reshoring policy, Korea's major conglomerate committed some $50 billion, for the investment in the United States. Now, in return, for this, Korea is getting it. At the moment, Korean economy faces really severe headwinds, not to mention about the slowest growth rate and rapidly rising inflation rate. But alarmingly, Korea already recorded about $50 billion the trade deficit. China now is our largest the trade the deficit economy. And for the first 3 months this year, Korea recorded about the $20 billion deficit vis-a-vis China. So I think this all is related to the Korean, trade performance, especially in semiconductor, the contraction to China market. And so in this regard, I think the Inflation Reduction Act and export control of semiconductor to China under what I call the security and trade nexus, logic, and U.S. established various, the guardrails. But many Koreans, are losing the credibility of the U.S. Initiative on this the export control on Korea's semiconductor to the U.S. Now, big question is that how we can draw a demarcation line between sensitive security items and the ordinary, the tradable, semiconductors, especially between the U.S. And Korea. I think U.S. unilaterally, imposed the line, setting up certain nano levels so on, but nobody agreed on this. So in this regard, I think the U.S. somehow should take, flexible stance to follow some sort of the internationally agreeable standard, okay, under which maybe Korean export to semiconductor China could be, refrained. So in this regard, I think the logic U.S. has employed seems to me very much the ad hoc, arbitrary, and by the U.S. a nationalistic, the commercial interest. Okay, that's the first question I want to raise. At the moment, unless Samsung and the SK are given some expected grace period longer than 1 year now. At the moment, the U.S. is thinking about this. I think Korean semiconductor industry will be severely impacted to make Korean economy really seriously crippled. So I hope at the forthcoming U.S.-Korea summit meeting, and I hope the President Biden will take this Korean issue very seriously, and to provide the longer grace period for Korean semiconductor investment in the U.S. And the second point I would like to raise is that of course Korea should join the Chip 4 Act, but the Koreans are now alarmed again that by the U.S. policy, all recipient companies of funding from the Chip 4 Act are required to submit the chip production schedule and profit in related data to the U.S. authority. Further, recipients are banned from building any new facilities. I think this is violating a fundamental free market enterprise system. Why, a country should submit all these our trading partners and also our internal, accounting records to the U.S. authority. So in this regard, I think there should be some, flexibility on this CHIP 4 Act, the funding requirement.
Well,
And
thank you.
last point.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Last point, I think that you indicate that the President Yoon made a very, in a sense, a goddamn nut solution at the Korea-Japan summit by taking third-party compensation scheme to the forced labor, victim. I really agree with that. Korea's very bold and forward-looking the solution initiated by the President Yoon. And well, at all, we are able to resolve almost 6 years, diplomatic standoff between, two countries. Now, my big question is that this is annoying me all the time. Yesterday, Japanese, government now they passed a new guideline for the textbook, elementary school textbook, claiming that Dokdo Island is belong to Japanese sovereign territory. Japan continued to raise the bar to claim the Dokdo's sovereignty. Previously, Japanese textbook indicated that the Dokdo Island is sort of disputed island between Korea and Japan. But now Japan, gave that statement and just claiming that the Dokdo Island in total belong to Japanese sovereignty. So I think if this continues, this might undermine the very trilateral, the security spirit you emphasized, and I hope that the forthcoming U.S.-Korea joint summit and maybe Japan might pressure, the U.S. might pressure Japan to tone down this, Dokdo issues, and Koreans can never accept Japanese claim. So in this regard, this is very highly sensitive issue and sort of stumbling block to promote a trilateral, the military, the collaborations. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ahn, for your three legitimate points. First two, more or less economic issues. The third one is very sensitive issue with Japan. Dr. Cha, your response.
Thanks, Dr. Ahn. It's good to see you again, and thank you for those wonderful comments. With regard to your points, with regard to export controls, I agree with you. I think that for the United States, for this strategy to succeed, it requires the cooperation of certain key countries, and Korea is one of those countries. For it to succeed, it has to be something where each country is a part of the rule-making body, and they're not simply dictated to unilaterally with regard to the rules. At CSI, is something that we have advocated for, that these countries should, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the United States should really come together and work as a group. And if it takes Korea, Japan, and Taiwan separately first to come together and understand what are the rules, the grace period, the time frame with regard to what is considered, cutting edge technology versus more the legacy technologies. These things all have to be agreed upon as a group. They can't be dictated by one side or the other. And then with regard to the grace period, the United States right now is doing this with countries that are economically coerced by China. So countries that are economically coerced by China, the United States tries to come up with different resilience measures, whether it's finding new export markets for this country, targeted country, or putting new US investment into this targeted country, creating incentives for companies to put investments in these countries. Lithuania is a good example of this. But these are resilience measures to compensate for the impact of China's economic coercion. The United States, on the other side, should also be thinking about impact mitigation and resilience measures for these countries and these companies that are being asked to make huge changes to their production line, to their business strategies, to the way they think about export markets. That it's not just a grace period, it's also creating some suite of resilience or impact mitigation measures to lessen the impact of these big shifts. Because that's the only way the strategy is going to work. It's not going to work if you just tell so-called partners to accept the pain, of cutting things off without any impact mitigation or any sort of resilience measures. And the same thing on Chip 4 as well. That this has to be a consensual decision-making group, and it can't simply be dictated by the United States. I think the problem is these mandates, or strategies come out of the White House, then they end up in the departments, and the departments, as they sort of devise the measures, are not thinking about grand strategy. They're just trying to think about how do we seal off China from access to this technology, and what do we need everybody to do? But then there's no feedback loop to the White House about what will allies say about this? Like, how will it affect them? And so I think this feedback loop has to be better reinforced. And one of the ways it's reinforced is when people like President Yoon or Prime Minister Kishida or Tsai Ing-wen, say to the United States, complain to the United States about how this is being done. I mean, that is one of the ways to ensure that it's not simply all put together by bureaucrats who don't understand the bigger alliance picture. And then with regard to Japan, I mean, I agree with you. It's not helpful at all for the Japanese Education Ministry to be approving textbooks at such a critical time after a major agreement between Korea and Japan, after a major summit meeting by the two leaders of the two countries.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Dr. Ahn, for your great comments and questions as usual. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to have, last but not least, we have a third discussant today. Given the time constraint, it has to be relatively brief. But let's invite Dr. Daniel Finn, who is Managing Director at MCI Group. And he has served in various executive and board positions at Korea's leading corporations, such as Hanwha, CJ, and KT. Dr. Shin was also nominated as Young Global Leader in 2016 by the World Economic Forum. Daniel, you're on.
Victor, it's good to have you here again. So my question is a little more market partisan perspective. After the Yoon-Kishida summit in Tokyo, President Yoon emphasized the economic benefits of improved relations between the two countries, as their trade between South Korea and Japan and foreign direct investment would significantly increase after round of talks between two countries. Korea and Japan should also work together to deal with the threats from North Korea. While North Korea keeps firing ICBM-class missile almost every other day, which could deter prospective economic prosperity in the region. I don't want to impose wrong impression here, but what if there is an imminent tension between South and North Korea before any potential China-Taiwan conflicts? North Korea does missile test perhaps to open and elevate the level of geopolitical tension furthering day by day, which frowns the face of investor and business people like me. So what's your view on that? Is there any advice for the market participant like me whose life must go on under these circumstances?
Thank you. Shin or Dr. Cha?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for your question. So the first thing I would say is that thus far, at least in studies that we have done, when we've looked at past North Korean provocations, they have not had an impact on, they have not had a permanent impact on the Kospi, the Nikkei, or the New York Stock Exchange. You know, there may have been small changes, but the recovery is within like a day or two. At least that's based on the data that we've collected. So, and that's largely in response to ballistic missile tests and nuclear tests. Having said that, I know that for investors, because I talked to many of them, the big concern for them is not necessarily what North Korea does, but what the United States does or does not do in reaction to these North Korean provocations. And in particular, if they see a reaction or lack thereof from the United States that is unexpected, that has a much larger impact on the way they think about the security of their investments and their capital in the country. I think it would really, as you know well, a lot of risk is already priced in. And so it would really have to take something quite major by North Korea without an adequate US response, or with an overreaction by the United States to really rattle and shake the way I think people think about these sorts of issues. That is not impossible, right? That is not impossible to imagine because of all the things that North Korea has been doing recently. That is not hard to imagine, but I would say that you know, again, there are lots of concerns about US extended deterrence and commitments, but I can tell you that from a DC perspective, there is no question for the United States that that they would respond to anything that North Korea did that really threatened peace on the Korean Peninsula. And that is in no small part because this would be something that not only affected millions of Koreans, it would also affect hundreds of thousands of Americans who are living both in Korea and Japan. So, you know, and this is despite the fact that there's a war in Europe and that there is Chinese assertiveness in the Taiwan Strait. I think the United States and US strategy and planners know that not showing up in Korea would do more damage to a Taiwan Straits contingency or to the war in Europe if they did not show up in Korea when something happened in Korea. And so so I'm not worried about the lack of a US reaction. Sometimes I worry about an overreaction, but I'm not worried about the lack of a US reaction. I don't think you'll get an overreaction with the Biden administration, because Biden is or with the Obama administration. But with a future Republican administration, it's possible that you could get an overreaction, as Trump almost did in 2017.
Okay, what's that? Are we okay? Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Shen. And it's about the time to close. We are already 10 minutes past our scheduled time. I would like to thank you very much, Victor, for your insightful presentation and discussions with our invited panels. I think, you know, for over the last year, much have been done to move along to strengthen a trilateral alliance between United States, Japan, and Korea. But throughout the conversation, and from your presentation, it's clear that we have some unresolved issues on an agenda to be further followed up in the coming years. And we all hope that forthcoming bilateral summit between the United States and Korea will help resolve some of the concerns, issues raised by our discussants today. With that, I would like to thank you again, Victor, for your great participation in our webinar. Hope to see you in person next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jin. Thank you to all the discussants, and it's really a pleasure to be with you. I enjoy the IGE seminar very much.
Okay, thank you. You too.